and in general isn't used as fully as it should be by those, particularly in more remote areas or kind of subnational areas. Certainly a guy at the district level is unlikely to be able to use the census data from his district in order to be able to better understand his denominators. So surveys become really important. There's no question that the power of a survey when it comes to having a numerator and a denominator from the same source, not to be sneezed at. So coverage, effectiveness, we lean heavily on these surveys, but meanwhile, it's a bit of a feeding frenzy out there from the donors who are all stepping on each other in order to be the one who funds the definitive survey. We've got the demographic and health surveys people, we've got the mixed people from UNICEF, we've got the LSMS, Living Standards Measurement Survey from the World Bank, we've got the World Health Survey from the WHO, and they're all struggling to tear each other's lungs out in order to be the one who has the best, most recent survey from each country. And often the country, needless to say, doesn't really own the data when it's done. Nonetheless, we shouldn't sneeze at the importance of this. When it comes to civil registration, it's sobering to realize that most people outside our business fail to remember that most people in the developing world are born and die without ever having been reported as an existence. So most babies are not only born, but whether you die soon thereafter or as a 90-year-old, generally most societies in the developing world and the least developed world have no record of people's existence. Even when those deaths take place in hospitals, there are frequently no record, and often the cause of death data are terrible. But that's a different set of problems, but I think it's worth pointing out that the health sector is not only sort of cheated of having access to birth and death data to be able to do a good job of its own work, but the health sector is a terrible citizen in the national information system scheme of things, because generally the health facilities do not submit the data on their own births and deaths to the national system. So there is little hope that there will be a credible civil registration and vital statistics system in many settings. It's beginning to change. One of the most encouraging things that we recently saw at the Summit for Civil Registration and Vital Statistics in Addis Ababa a few months ago, just before the end of the year, was that there's massive demand from ministers of justice, ministers of the interior, ministers of finance, for real, credible civil registration and vital statistics systems. So I think it will be incumbent upon those of us from the health information sector to find a way to be really constructive players in helping to make that happen. So our patient with her exercise book is, those are all what I've just spoken about are the population-based data sources. Our patient with the exercise book is what most people think of when they are thinking about health information systems in developing countries. Most people think of individual health records more often. But the information is also crucial for managing the broader health system, for tracking the infrastructure, including what facilities are out there. Many countries, as you know, don't even know how many hospitals or health centers they have. Alarming. And managing and tracking services, or trying to improve quality, or trying to sort out where the human resources are being deployed or how well they're performing is obviously an important challenge for information systems, and often unmet. And then, of course, laboratory services are generally poorly recorded and brought together. There's more and more attention, which I think is very encouraging, on logistics management system, because human resources are not a terribly large proportion of the expense for an individual service, but the vaccines and drugs are hugely expensive, and require foreign exchange in developing countries. So these, trying to get a handle on where the vaccines and drugs are is something that countries are beginning to pay much more attention to, in order to make sure that the drugs are out there, that there is decent coverage, and that there is some accountability for where those things are going. There is, however, a vibrant private sector in most of these least developed countries, which is completely ignored. People pay attention primarily to government-funded, government-managed, government-owned service centers, service delivery sites, and fail to pay attention to the fact that in many places 80% of services, or at least over half, are being provided within the private sector. Mm-hmm. And nobody has a very clear idea of how to get a handle on that. So it's finally the patient who suffers, and so we need to figure out how we're going to make that happen. There are, however, barriers. This just a sort of very small representation of the number of sort of development assistance agencies and contractors and partnerships that are out there trying to get things done. And believe me, they're better funded than the average developing country manager, and they get their data, they get their information, and they turn out, sadly enough, to be barriers. I guess I should say, because I'm among them. We end up being barriers to trying to get, trying to strengthen the information system. So this development assistance industry, or the development assistance industrial complex, although they're not such a complex, turns out to be a bit of a problem and leads to some of this vicious cycle that we see, wherein the weak information systems lead donors and other agencies to just go out and collect their own data, and therefore, the ownership nationally and the demand for information to become, well-informed and credible is just not there, because it's much too much owned by outsiders. And just one more thing that is worth raising here, just about weak systems, is, and our managers love to whine about not having enough money. I mean, everybody whines about not having enough money. So, or not having weak human resources. And there's no question that our informants in 27 African countries did indeed say, yeah, we need more money and we need stronger human resources. Interestingly enough, they thought their information technology systems were relatively good, but they overwhelmingly identified policy as the weakest part of their system. And so one thing I think I would love to see us discuss over the next couple of days among this crowd is how can we help countries strengthen, articulate better policies. This is a huge opportunity. I think the Civil Registration of Vital Statistics meeting that we just came from is a great example. I was besieged by ministers afterwards saying, for God's sake, just give me a model law and I will have it in place in a month. But there aren't any. Why can't we, in this room, get together and unpack what the components of a credible policy are? At least, and lay out what the options are, best options to solve some of those problems, and what's worked, the data about what's worked, so that each country doesn't have to invent a new policy wheel. This seems an obvious global public good that I hope we can begin to do a better job of. So how do we change the game? I think this group, we don't really need to say too much to this group about the potential importance of standards or integration. I think I'm preaching to the choir on this. and the importance of technologies. But I do hope we will remember over and over again that we understand the importance of these things, but the rest of the world doesn't. So we need to make sure that we not only document the effectiveness of information in changing efficiencies and changing outcomes, we need to really make a fair amount of fuss about it so that policymakers will have the support they need to invest in their information systems. And I think it's interesting that both Abdul and Mary Ellen raised the issue of doctors. As a doctor, I risk being thrown out of my labor union here, but I think it's worth saying that doctors are major barriers in all three of these areas. They hate standards. You know, we're all artists, right?
All my patients are unique.
Yes, all of my patients are unique, and I am unique, for God's sake, yes, quite right. And, you know, they are famously technophobic. I mean, there are a few guys, they're mostly guys, who do pretty well with technology, but in general, they resist the fundamental system changes that come with technologies. And business case, oh dear, you know, they don't really like documenting the cost effectiveness of anything, because that's a threat too. All right, so please don't tell on me. I don't want to be thrown out of my labor union, but there you go. And briefly, I think you heard, for those of you who were here yesterday, a little bit from Liz Peloso about Health Metrics Network, and I won't bore you with that now. But it is a mechanism whereby I think we can all kind of bank the knowledge that we have about the state of the art with regard to standards and make sure that we continually update the Health Metrics Network framework and standards. I see I didn't do that very well, but the framework and standards for country information systems is, I think, a very useful way to communicate systematically with countries and reflect emerging knowledge. So, integration, and I think district health management is a great example of something that is going to live or die based on how we really manage to integrate information. And I can't emphasize enough that there really is a huge culture gap between the public health people, the management people on one side, and the clinicians on the other. And I think we are uniquely well positioned as informatics people to really encourage and facilitate an integration across those two major sources of data in order to really improve both private health and public health. And I think that's something that I think we can talk about more over the next couple of days. Handhelds, I mean, there is, and on that point, I think it's also worth pointing out that I think Canada Health Infoway has been an important model for the overdeveloped world about how one can integrate and really try and pull a real system together instead of having disparate chunks of informatics going on out there. But I would predict that the developing world will get it first in terms of really showing the potential power and health benefits of a really integrated, well digitized system, because I think the institutional barriers are lower and the demand is higher for really integrating. So we need to be there. So handhelds, whether they're at the bedside or in communities, I think are an exciting bit. I don't need to tell you guys this. The cell phones are out there. There's a 13% annual growth rate in ownership of mobile phones. I've just come from this massive conference in Barcelona, the GSMA meeting. Oh dear, what an industry. and there's been